Hello, everyone. This is Warren from the SEO Club podcast. I am today joined by Martin Calvert, who is Marketing Director at ICS Digital. Martin, it's a pleasure having you here. You're bringing plenty of experience, having been working in the SEO industry for, I believe, a significant number of years, around 10 years or so. It's really exciting to have you on board. And why don't you give a bit of an introduction about yourself, and then we can move on to the topic for today. I mean, we'll be discussing content and SEO. It's not a surprise with that, but I'll leave you to it.
Yeah, no, happy to be here, and thanks everyone for listening. As you say, Ron, I've been involved in SEO in one form or another for a little bit over 10 years now, I guess going back to 2012. And yeah, worked client side in various roles, but now work for ICS Digital and ICS Translate. We are a pretty large content focused agency, so the topic is really relevant. And I guess we've seen pretty much everything there is to see when it comes to content over the years and how things have morphed from just words on a page through to like multimedia, multi-channel content, the rise of AI, and I guess lots of different permutations of content through our specialism in highly regulated, highly competitive industries where content can really make the difference between profit and the opposite of profit. So yeah, really interested and excited for the discussion as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned, I mean, you've been in this industry as long as I have, and it's always changing, right? But it seems in probably the last year and a half, 2 years, people are more on their toes. Google is becoming more erratic, so to speak. And we did go into a period where we used to see a lot of rehashed content and people doing a lot of the same. Are you seeing anything happen in particular with any of the work that you're doing in recent months with Google? There's obviously algorithm changes and ranks go up and down and so on. Is there anything of note, however, from content point of view?
Well, I think you kind of the volatility you mentioned, all of these recent updates. I think it has, in a positive way, inspired people to be a bit more creative and experimental to see how can they get ahead. And I think your point of how SEO is always changing. Yes, I think that's true. Also, as you suggest, we were also quite confident in the direction of travel, like what SEO is for quite a while. It wasn't like enormous upsets like, the penguin and panda stuff. We sort of knew what was happening. And now, as you say, Google does seem to be quite erratic, like less predictable and not in a good way. And I think that does raise questions of, does Google actually know what it wants? Can Google police the type of content that it's looking to reward or punish? And it feels like not so much. I think they're making some effort now at the time of recording to correct some of the steps that were taken in March and to some extent May this year. But yeah, I do think it's a time where experimentation is important, but things are a little bit more mysterious than previous years. That's kind of what I would say. But because of that, you see people doing lots of different things. And when it comes to like our part of this, in some cases we are setting strategy and, setting a plan and a rationale and delivering things. To be quite honest, in other situations, clients treat us as a supplier to deliver what they want. Like we're following the recipe that they prepare. And unless people are doing something really risky, that's fine for us as well, So in doing that, we learn a lot about different things, but we also are in the same boat as everybody else. We're waiting to see what is going to happen for the rest of the year and which content formats are going to perform best.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned you're seeing some changes again, probably following the completion of the August update. Have you noticed any reverses from the helpful content update and the March and May updates?
I mean, I think we're all looking for this. I mean, I think any, sizable agency or any company or individual that runs multiple sites, you're going to see a spread of results. Some people quite a few people we were working with felt no impact and they thought it was kind of a fuss over nothing. Other people were really hit quite hard. And in some cases, you could say, well, that's probably 5 years overdue. In other cases, you'd think, well, I don't even know why this site is suffering because it seems perfectly fine. And I think sometimes this comes down to what Google is always afraid of, which is if Google is too clear about what to do and what not to do, people will then just follow that advice regardless of whether it's right for the site or the audience. But then I also think that means Google then punishes things that it shouldn't punish. So, for example, a couple of years ago, Google was quite keen on talking about structured data, structured content, usability, using tables of content, using things like this to really make navigation easier. But now it seems, they're conscious that people might be putting erroneous tables of content in there. So maybe a table of content is not helping you. Maybe it's hurting you. And that kind of sucks because it might not be providing the best user experience, but it doesn't deserve to be punished. And this comes back to what the fundamental problem we all have with Google is Google doesn't really like SEO, the concept, and talks about SEO in a very moralistic way. They talk about violation of spam policies that none of us signed up for. They talk about transgression and breaches and even the word spam. It's a really loaded moralistic term. So I don't think that should be applied to everybody who just wants to have their content be more visible or who's trying to grow their business, because that's the game. That's what everybody's trying to do with PR, with advertising, with sponsorship. Of course you're trying to promote your business. So I think that's a really tricky thing that we're always going to have to get to grips with. But to your point about recovery from helpful content, I think we've seen a few kind of hints here and there, and I think we'll see more of that as autumn rolls on, because I think people know that good sites were punished that shouldn't have been punished. And certainly algorithmically. But there's also sites that you have to say some kind of site-wide classifier has been put on this site and they're going to really struggle. And in some cases, you'd think, well, you're probably better starting again, especially if it's a smaller site that you haven't invested too much in. But you've still got to take that view of, do I work on something that's fundamentally broken? And that, I think, is really hard to advise people on that right now, because we don't know if Google's going to roll back even more substantially and things will be fine. So I think it's a really tricky situation for site owners and even mainstream media publishers.
Yeah, you mentioned sort of Google being more tight-lipped about what they're doing. I think it's purposeful ambiguity in a way. They do see SEOs as trying to trick their search engines, which in reality, we look at certain patterns, we look at what they are saying, what we see from actual tests, but spotting those patterns has probably, since the helpful content update, become a bit harder due to that erratic nature. So some of the websites that I've seen that are running very similar strategies, one of them gets hit, the other one gets a boost, and there's no clear distinction with what works or not. So if you're a site owner, at this point, where do you even start? I think you have to test. That is probably the only reasonable, logical way where you can see a content strategy, test to a certain extent, and then backtrack and see what is working, what is not working. But for smaller organizations, this might even be a challenge budget-wise. How much money are they going to have for testing?
I totally agree. And it's also how much you need to invest to make a fair test, because you might have some activity going on. Even at the end, you're still not confident of which way to go. I think that's something where affiliates in particular have some advantages, but they have some disadvantages. The advantages, usually they have complete control over their site. It's usually pretty flexible if it's on WordPress or some other, standard CMS. They can get content up. They don't have layers of bureaucracy or sign off. They can just do it. The downside is they might not have the team size or budget to experiment properly. And I think that's where it's really, really tricky and where Google does owe a few answers to people. I guess to your point about how one brand might benefit, one brand might suffer, what we do see is people in different industries having different experiences. So there does seem to be this emphasis in terms of content that Google wants to reward sites that are the end destination for the user. So if you're a site that has a booking engine for travel, or you are the place where people buy a product, or they can get the definitive, authoritative answer that they seek, perhaps from a academic site or from a government site, you'll probably have an easier time compared to a middleman, which is what the affiliate tier usually is. You're attracting traffic and then redirecting that traffic to somewhere else to monetize. And I think that's what a lot of affiliates are really challenged by. But I don't think they should give up hope. I think, as you say, there is room for experimentation. And there's always going to be a need for interpretation, opinion, first-hand experience, user-generated content, that type of stuff. So I think it is worth that level of experimentation that you referred to.
You mentioned, yes, it's Google wanting to send the user to kind of the final destination. And interestingly enough, in one of the recent podcasts that we had, we took a number of search results and we went to Google US, because typically that is kind of the latest version of the algorithm. And we were trying to see if we spot any patterns, any results. And most of the results we were seeing were big brands, big authoritative content that probably in the eyes of Google, they can be trusted. But if you're a small organization and you're trying to get people to find you when they search for you, I'm not sure anymore whether Google can be a reliable source to base a part of your income on, because it's going to be increasingly hard to compete with big publishers who do have significant budgets, particularly when Google seems to be prioritizing these brands because of the authority they've built over the years. And if you're a new business who might still be an expert at what you do, you're good at what you're doing, but you're essentially trying to compete with bigger budgets, bigger teams, bigger staff, bigger time even to dedicate to specifically SEO. It's a struggle. And you touched upon UGC. Reddit, for example, was present in all of the searches that we did. So you're doing the work and then you're seeing user-generated content, probably due to the partnership that they have done with Reddit. And it's suddenly much more visible than your business.
And I think it's difficult because, 3 years ago, I think it'd be fairly straightforward to advise people on how to set up a digital business and how to monetize. I think it'd be very difficult to advise somebody to say, now is a great time to start your website from scratch. That's a really difficult thing to suggest. But I am an optimist here. I do think there will be a correction. And one of the reasons I think that is because this has gone beyond SEO geeks talking about this, and it's definitely in the mainstream now. Like mainstream people who are not computer savvy, they're not in digital agencies, they're not affiliates, they're not, entrepreneurs. They're going, why are my results so poor? Why do I need to work harder to find the thing that I want? Why is Reddit here all the time? And so I do think there is and will be a correction, and I hope it'll lead to more stability. In principle, I understand what Google's going for, because there's always been garbage content, and we all know, like, let's say you're looking up a recipe. Like, I don't want to read 800 words about somebody's life story to then get to the recipe and go through 7, embedded ads. That's awful content. And we lived with that before. So I do understand this urge with Google to go towards more succinct, straight to the answer content, but they've overshot it with Reddit because that's so open to manipulation. People will start a thread with the question that they want to rank for, wait for some answers, put their own answer at the end, and delete other people's answer. This is like 2010, 2009 type SEO stuff. So I think that will go eventually. But that's because the mainstream media, the mainstream individuals have picked up on it. And I think for the first time in a long time, Google is conscious of competitive threats from AI, from ChatGPT, from maybe even other search engines on the fringes that might be chipping away, that people might give a go. They might give it a try because they're so fed up with Google. And it's not impossible for things to, really be eroded. It doesn't mean Google will disappear, but if their market share goes down to 80%, that's a big deal. A phenomenal amount of money. People will lose their jobs over that. And we've seen that
Absolutely.
happen with Friendster and MySpace, and to a various extent, Yahoo, AOL, Time Warner, these massive companies that seemed, to be unbeatable. It does happen. So we'll see how it goes.
And we see, I think, that hypocrisy as well in a way from Google's side. So we're told if you follow webmasters and what they're officially saying is write content on your website, and if it's good content, it's going to rank. And
Yeah.
they don't want that degree of manipulation. But in most searches, you're seeing Reddit being manipulated. Parasite SEO, there has been a clampdown on some websites, but others are still significantly going stronger. So, on one hand, Google is referring to us as spam and abusing of their algorithm. On the other hand, it seems their algorithm is also not up to scratch to detecting all of
Yeah,
that. And
I
it
would
ends
agree.
up being a cat and mouse game.
And if I want to sound like a conspiracy theorist for a moment, I think one of the reasons why they had to do some of the manual penalties and manual actions in May was because algorithmically it wasn't enough to displace the most egregious parasite SEO from Forbes and so on, because Google is so dependent on links. Links are still so hugely important, and they've done a great job of persuading people, even agencies. Oh yeah, links are not a big deal. Links are spam. I think that's a big reason why they had to do manual actions to kind of cool down some of these big sites, because the content quality wasn't there. It was just the authoritative nature of the domain. And I think that's a really tricky thing to get to grips with. And it'll still exist for a while, I think. There'll be like a middle tier of parasite SEO, not, publishers with 200 years of heritage, like a Forbes or a Business Insider or whatever. It'll be, just really well established publishers who are continuing to monetize. But eventually, I think there'll be a way to cool that. And I think the reason why they don't want to totally disincentivize or discourage smaller creators is that they need that content to train their AI on. They need that content to, serve as even just like a representative sample for what good could look like. Even if they end up going to pick the big website, they still need to have a cluster for semantic understanding of content. So we'll see how it goes. But I do think you're right. I think there's an issue with site-wide penalties or de-indexing. So it's not a case of if you have a small site that's not very good and you do one amazing article that Google will go, this is amazing. I will rank this because it deserves it. I don't believe it when they say that. I really, and they say we rank pages, not sites. I don't believe that now.
Yeah, yeah, I fully agree with you. Have you seen any clients or have you done any work in relation to user-generated content? It's even channels like TikTok and the popularity surge that they
Yeah,
have had and the interest of people in even checking reviews and so on.
yeah, and I think it kind of bleeds over into other areas which are really hard to quantify when you're at an SEO agency, because we don't really know what the real definitive impact is of having that footprint on social or having that UGC, that level of organic interaction. But it feels like that's a good thing to do because we know Google likes brands. They know Google likes trusted entities. So it does feel, and this is something we've pushed for a long time, build up an organic audience where you can, even if it's CRM, so it's a bit behind the curtain. But if you do have a social following that is semi-public, so like on X/Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, I think it's very debatable what Google sees on Telegram or things like this, or even TikTok, to be honest. I'm not really sure. I think having that footprint is no bad thing. It's really hard to say if you invest in that, you'll make X amount of dollars, but it feels like the right thing to do, especially now that there is this algorithmic trend towards user-generated content. We've been talking about EAT for years now. So that if there are personal perspectives that you can draw out from social, real examples, showing that you have a real physical location, all this type of stuff, I do think there's a real value in that, and it overlaps with all these other areas which have been around that are not so recent, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, it seems to have gone back in most cases to brand building, and Google is just kind of in SEO, we refer to it as building the entity, but it's essentially building your brand and being visible where your audience is.
Yeah, and I think that's also where I'm definitely not a computer scientist, but that's also how I sort of understand the algorithm is working now. This relationship between entities, and the kind of the BERT element of how it parses information. I think it is just looking for an enhanced understanding of how entities relate to each other semantically, but then also in terms of just pure function. How is site discovery carried out? It's still through links, mentions, all this type of stuff. So I think it's all quite familiar, but it's taking on more importance now because all of this machine learning and AI stuff is happening, and they're trying to train up, an understanding of how the world works and how concepts, businesses, people relate to one another. I think that's why there's this renewed focus, even though weirdly they've placed less emphasis on schema and that type of markup, but maybe they have more faith in their, in Gemini and ChatGPT, OpenAI to actually understand things without that guidance. I'm not sure.
Yeah. It seems to me, at least in looking at a lot of these updates, it seems Google is somewhat threatened by these other upcoming platforms. And I mentioned TikTok particularly because of the astronomical growth that it had. And when I look at some of the content that some brands publish there, it's kind of going on that UGC element. So I'm sure you've seen Ryanair and their posts and how they, it is a company, but they're showing the human element. They're joking in the same way that people typically do on these platforms. Do you think these updates from Google are kind of a knee-jerk reaction to that? It's because they're seeing a threat looming where their product is not ready to reach there?
I think they're conscious that searches might begin somewhere else other than Google. And I know some people say that TikTok is a search engine. I think it's a website with a search function, or an app with a search function. But nevertheless, I think to Google, it's the same issue. If people start their search on somewhere else other than Google, they're not getting a cut of that revenue. They're not showing their advertisements. They're not harvesting data. I think that's the big thing. If people start to search for flash sales or fashion stuff on TikTok, or if they're following lots of, let's say, fashion brands or travel brands on Instagram and will buy through that, or something they've seen on there will spark a search within the app, not Google. I think they're conscious of that. And I think that's why, humor that you see on TikTok, like the Ryanair type thing, is probably something that Google wants to understand, because I think they're looking for more authentic content. So the example I gave earlier of the recipe, where there's 800 words of preamble about the person, where they were born, where they traveled, stuff about their dad, and then they eventually get to the recipe. That's the pretense of authentic content. That's definitely not real content. That is very purposeful. Whereas something funny and silly and memeable, like Ryanair stuff, like, certain reels, like certain, audio clips that get repeated over and over. That's more about togetherness and being part of something else rather than, something that will alienate you. And I think that's probably what Google sees as stickier, more engaging, more immediate content. It's just if it can understand that. But right now it's still clearly trying to balance that out with, well, if it's on this big publication, it must be trustworthy. So, I don't know.
And I think they see themselves as a more trustworthy source, because if you think about also the content on different platforms, content which ranks on Google typically has longer lifespan. It's more permanently there, so to speak, unless a Google update wreaks havoc on your website. Whereas content that's consumed on these social media channels, so to speak, has a very, very short shelf life. So even if you're an organization working with that type of content, your content production loop needs to be as fast as the
Yeah,
users are consuming.
I would agree. And also just to keep things relevant and also compete where you can be effective, because otherwise it's a really quick way to burn money or to seem cringe or to seem out of your depth, all of which is terrible. So it's like people say video is really important. Video is important, but if it's a badly lit video and you look unhealthy and you look slow, that doesn't do your brand any good. It's still got to be good. So I think that's a very tricky thing to balance up with these different elements when you're looking at all of the things you could be doing. You still need to make a choice about where to prioritize, where you can compete, look at what competitors are doing, see how you can do something a little bit different. But I agree that the turnover is much quicker. And I think one of the reasons, again, me being a conspiracy theorist, I think one of the reasons why content on Google SERPs doesn't change as quickly. They shuffle things around a little bit. Like the top 3 will change quite a bit. They'll test
Yeah.
things out. I do think it comes down to the strengths of domain often, and the amount of link building and digital PR that somebody's done. They're not going to toss up a new answer every 6 months just because it's more timely. I think Google results are still more guided towards what is seen as authoritative, which has citations. You know what I mean? So, but I mean, they're still trying to play with that with the AI overview type stuff. So maybe that will change. It's one thing where being agile as a content creator really helps to think, what can I do that's going to surface my brand in all these different ways, and then lean into what Google ends up actually doing. That's what we're all trying to do. We're trying to figure out what's next, but not overcommit to one channel because it might be the wrong one. You've got to still have that
Absolutely.
experimental mindset.
Do you think people in general will switch from Google? Where, we have AI search GPT is now on the horizon. Is Google's market share at a risk of going down? Is it easy
Um,
for consumers to jump ship?
I mean, I don't know. Like they are richer than some countries, so if they want to fix stuff, they can. But I also get the impression they're more corporate than they used to be, less engineer led, more shareholder led. And if there are more short term thinking shareholders involved, maybe they don't care about the product so much. Maybe they just care about monetization for the short term, and then they'll move on to other things. So I think that's probably not. I'm not like a business genius or anything. That would be my thinking. I think if their market share goes down, I think that's very possible. And if it keeps going down, you might see some more cash grab type activity. More turnover of senior leaders there, less guidance, less structure, less purpose. And I think that could result in an opportunity for other people to really succeed. Um, and you see that with a lot of big tech companies. Once they lose their founding principle or the purpose, and it's all about short-term shareholder value, things can start to take a bit of a turn. But I mean, they don't. That doesn't need to happen. They have so much money and resource. They can do anything they want. They could probably put a man on the moon if they wanted to. It's just a case of will they end up, complicating things for themselves with all these different people fighting things out. I don't know.
They do have strong partnerships as well. By default, and it used to be, I think it still is on iOS, it's Google. Now with antitrust laws, their devices are forced to ask what is your search engine of choice. I mean, people are mostly already familiar with Google, so I still suspect most people will choose Google. And that's where, what if a next best product comes out? Is an iPhone going to kill the BlackBerry, Google the BlackBerry in this case?
Yeah, I think that's it. And I don't mean to be insulting, but we are a certain age. So there might be 12-year-olds and 15-year-olds who don't have that same attachment to Google or same familiarity. They're not sentimental about it. They're not wedded to Google or Android's way of doing things. So who knows what will happen? I think that's the interesting thing at the moment. What I hope is this interesting environment actually results in more innovation and more opportunity for businesses, especially small businesses. Unfortunately, what we've seen recently is more volatility and more pain for a lot of businesses. So, like I say, I'm an optimist. I hope it results in more good stuff, more transparency, and more opportunities to surface your business, whether it's an affiliate or an e-commerce store or professional services, whatever it happens to be. I really hope there's more opportunities for people to grow and do things the right way. Because, as you said before, there's so many different content formats. There's so many ways to do it. It'd just be nice to have more stability with how that gets surfaced.
Yeah. Any final thoughts, Martin? Any advice to people working in the content and SEO space that might be struggling right now?
Yeah, I think so the grumpy, cynical side would be if things really feel like it's the end of the road. Maybe it is the end of the road, and sometimes we need to be honest about that. I think certainly in some of the highly regulated spaces that we work in, you'll see sites that are like, they're evaluating top 10 casino providers, for example, with very thin content. And you could say, you've made your money over the years. It's the end of the road. You're not differentiating. For other people, I think it's a case of being creative, experimental, paying close attention to what Google says, but not being wedded to it, and following competitors closely, not copying, but being inspired and really digging in, because there will be some attrition. There will be people who give up. Certainly, there's lots of people who have switched from traditional affiliation, for example, through to, YouTube or creating followings in other ways, mailing lists, Telegram channels, that type of thing. That's all legitimate. But what that might mean is more competitive opportunities for those who stick to web. So I think it's worth seeing what's going on in your niche and just being as experimental as you can, not throwing good money after bad, but also if you share my optimistic mindset, thinking how might things change in the next 6 months, because there is public demand for Google to be good. The public want Google to be good. And we've seen, I think this month, we've seen a few different indications that things might be changing a little bit. So, yeah, be optimistic where it makes sense to be optimistic, and cut your losses where it doesn't. That's the cynical Scottish view, I suppose.
That's the perfect advice. Martin, thank you so much. It was a genuine pleasure talking to you. Guys, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you do like this content, we'll be having more podcasts and content coming soon on the SEO Club on our channel. Thank you so much and have a good rest of the day.